I just got back from a conference in New Orleans, and I wanted to share a little bit about my experience there because I thought it was really beautiful. Kind of like with these recordings, I used my time there and specifically a workshop that I was offering at the conference, which is called the Points of Light Conference. It's for volunteer managers, nonprofits, nonprofit executives, community engagement folks, basically people who are out there trying to build community to create change in local ways. And the workshop I was there to offer was all about reimagining or rethinking what resilience means, especially right now with everything going on. And I tried two experiments while I was there. One was to not network. I find networking to be incredibly exhausting. I'm pretty empathic or sensitive or whatever word you want to use, and so being around large groups of people is actually pretty stressful on my system and exhausts me. So instead, I tried this experiment where I found kind of a chair on the outskirts of the conference. It was in a hotel, and planted myself there and read a book, worked on my playlist of intro music for my workshop, and just lightly held the intention that whoever would be, the most beneficial, most aligned person to speak with at the conference, that they would magically appear next to me. Absolutely insane. But it worked. I was sitting there for like maybe 6 or 7 minutes working on my playlist, and this amazing person came and sat right next to me. And we had a beautiful conversation about energy and community organizing and what it means to make change right now. It was such a deeply connected, nourishing conversation with one of the few people at the conference who also has nothing to do with the world of volunteering. So that experiment felt really generative. It felt really interesting to kind of trust the intelligence of the space and trust the energy of presence, that when I dropped into that, the field kind of organized itself so that a really cool person would sit next to me. You could think that that's a coincidence. It's happened to me enough times in the world that at this point, I think feels like something to be trusted. And I took that energy with me into the workshop. Now, I had no idea how many people would come to this workshop. It was one of, if not one of the only workshops at this conference that had nothing explicitly to do with volunteering. I think in the description, what I said was, we have as a sector, the nonprofit sector, the impact sector, public service, it come to accept burnout as an accepted cost of doing business. And how is that okay? How are we okay with that? Let's look at some strategies that can help us and our teams and our volunteers navigate our work in a gentler, more connected way. And about 200 people showed up. For reference, there's about 1,200 people at the conference, so that's 15 to 18% of the entire conference showed up for this. The whole room was packed. They had their notebooks ready. And the experiment, even though I had a lot of content that I did, was I decided to simply trust the field and trust relationship to take us where we wanted to go. The other thing I'll add before I share a little bit about how it all unfolded is that this workshop was right after lunch and like a dessert networking thing. So people came in and they were really tired. I could tell that they were zonked. They were zonked. A couple of people kind of came in, their heads were already nodding. They were already nodding off. So the first thing that I did, as soon as everybody was settled, is that I asked everyone to get up and stand in a massive circle all around the room. And there were groans and like, do we have to? They did. And then we did this beautiful exercise of of starting and imagining a fire in the center of the room, and people walked around a bit, and I facilitated just a brief story sharing exercise. The whole thing took maybe 7 or 8 minutes, and as I had them share afterwards, people were sharing that they felt more connected, they felt energized, that they hadn't realized how much tension they'd been holding in their body until they started connecting with each other, not about work, but just about things that brought them joy. It was such like an immediate shift. It was so cool to witness. And then as we made our way through the session, it felt, as much as it could with 200 people in the room, like 200 people having a conversation and sharing their stories about what it means to be resilient, what it means to have experienced burnout, real burnout, not just stress or anxiety, but the kind of technical burnout where your nervous system loses the ability to process stimuli, right? The whole thing kind of shuts down because it needs to recalibrate and recharge. And at one point, I asked people to raise their hands if they'd experienced that, and probably 75 or 80% of the room raised their hand, and it was heartbreaking that so many people who have dedicated so much of their time and energy and heart and passion to helping, that in exchange for that, in addition to probably not great pay, they also experience burnout. It's heartbreaking. And so we then went on to kind of crowdsource a toolbox. And what was beautiful about this is most of it was just them interacting with each other, sharing what works for them, what helps refill their cup. And when we go to conferences, I think that so many of us go into this mode of I'm here to receive from a nominal expert at the front of the room. And I did my best to defray that or debunk that. The last thing that we did in the session was a really brief exercise. It comes from the Heart Math Institute. It's a whole beautiful toolbox and field of work. But it's an exercise in creating deep coherence or group coherence where everybody kind of pays attention to their breath and then makes a sincere attempt to experience a regenerative emotion like joy, love, compassion, belonging. And what happens, right, what the research shows is that when you do this, you go from being dysregulated or incoherent, which if we were to look at a heart rate of somebody who's experiencing that state, it looks kind of jagged and irregular. So we go from that state to, as we go through this exercise, coherence, which looks like high amplitude waves that are very regular when it comes to the heartbeat, also the breathing. It also changes your brainwave state. But what was amazing about this is that we did it as a group. People, many of whom have no experience meditating, no experience with yoga, nothing, they were able to shift the entire energy of a 200-person room of incredible people in about 3 or 4 minutes. And they all felt it. They experienced, shared that they experienced a greater sense of safety and presence in their body, a sense of connection with everyone in the room. One person said that they could feel their breath for the first time and longer than they could remember. And it made me realize, or reminded me of how little it can take to create massive shifts in people's experience of spaces, of each other, of themselves. And it left me both incredibly inspired and so with a sense of like deep gratitude to have been able to witness that and facilitate a space where it became possible, but also with this question of why aren't we doing this all the time? I'll probably record another one of these soon there was a lot at this conference about AI, and I've been finding ways to be in relationship with AI that feel aligned. But this thing that AI can't do, which is it can't create, it can't experience something like group coherence. It can't come into reconnection with its body. It can't, it just doesn't have a body. These are things that we as living beings, as members of an ecosystem, can do. It seems so obvious, and yet these are not the things that are privileged in our leadership, in our workspace, um, in our change making. I went to a couple of sessions at this conference, and they were what you would expect. The content was fine, it was good, but everybody was just sitting watching a presenter. The presenter was reading off slides. And I wonder what will need to shift for us to realize that when we gather in person, it's an incredible privilege. If COVID taught us nothing else, or taught me nothing else, it's that being together in a room with people is such a gift. And so when we get the chance to gather in conferences with like-minded, like-hearted people who share our passions, why would we not design for those things that are so uniquely human? And not take away from the strategy, right? Not take away from all of the technical stuff we need to know how to do to run volunteer programs, lead organizations, whatever it might be. So I'm really interested in exploring that and bringing this to more gatherings, more convenings, more conferences. Where are those spaces that are intentional and useful, that are not about spiritual practice or taking a break, but are integrated into just the normal flow of the conference so that people can experience that coherence? And as a couple people shared with me later that evening, we saw each other walking around the city. They felt shifted as they moved through the rest of the conference, that there was something different about the way that they were moving through relationships, through the field of convening, through the field of the conference, that they experienced is quite different than before they came to the workshop. And I wonder what would be possible if we all experience that shift on a regular basis so that we can move through our work differently, move through our lives with a greater awareness and attunement to this field. Let's see what else wants to come through. I'm curious, as you're listening to this, what, if anything, might be coming up for you? And where might be opportunities to bring in a little of this experiment of trusting the field, of efforting less, if that feels aligned for you and your energy, and allowing the field to, I call it the field, consciousness, spirit, whatever we want to call it, allowing that to do half the work, where our job is to show up and then things begin to unfold in a different way. It feels like that's right on the edge of something big, right? Like, right, it's like a doorway to massive possibility and massive shift. So maybe we can just take a breath together into that possibility, and then we'll close our field notebook for now and be back soon. So let's just take a nice slow breath in and release it. I don't know if you can hear it, but as we did that, there was just this beautiful breeze that came through. You probably, if you're watching this visually, you probably saw it wiggling the leaves behind me. There it is again. All right. Thank you for listening. See you again soon.